Hey, seventh graders, Mr. Farley here, looking at chapter 16.3 today. 16.3, moving through the chapter titled Slavery between 1820 and 1861. We're looking at 16.3, and this is titled The Crisis Deepens. There is going to be, as usual, a copy of this mini lecture on your Schoology feed for you to review, along with your vocab terms for this section, two of which appear on this worksheet. There are a few other words in 16.3, and you can access those on your Schoology feed as well, as long as, in addition to accessing on Quizlet.com. Today, we're going to be talking about the crisis over slavery deepening. And let's look first at two vocab terms on 16.3. First word is guerrilla warfare, and we know guerrilla from earlier in the school year. This term very similar, guerrilla warfare, the use of hit and run tactics. We saw this in our study of American history first this year when we were looking at the tactics during the French and Indian War, and then again the tactics that the American colonists used successfully to frustrate the British during the American Revolution. Also, we're going to look at the term lawsuit. Lawsuit is a legal case brought to settle a dispute between persons or groups. So there's two of our vocab terms for this section: guerrilla warfare and lawsuit. So when you guys are finished with this mini lecture and you're ready to attack the questions, please do those questions on a Google Doc and number them for me. Let's look at the reading first. Some of this will be familiar because we've talked a lot about this in class up to now. In 1854, the issue of slavery in the Western territories will arise again. We saw in the last section, in the Compromise of 1850 section, we saw the issue of slavery come up with respect to slavery in the territories. We're also going to look here in 1854. Two new states in 1854 were created by the Kansas and Nebraska Act, and not surprisingly, those two states are going to be Kansas and Nebraska, both created by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And in each state, the issue of popular sovereignty would be decided, or the issue of slavery, rather, would be decided by popular sovereignty. That term again, popular sovereignty, again, that refers to the people deciding, okay? The people deciding. So the issue of slavery is going to be decided by the people in those territories, in those states, okay? And both pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers are going to move to Kansas. Pro-slavery bands or pro-slavery groups of people from the state of Missouri flooded Kansas. These men were known as border ruffians, members of the bands who used violence and voted illegally to vote in favor of legislatures and elected officials who would allow slavery, and they would go from town to town inflicting violence on those groups who had settled there and supported the abolitionist cause. As a result, the pro-slavery group won control of the legislature in the area, and it soon passed laws in support of slavery, meaning that people who were moving west into the Kansas and Nebraska states, the new states that were established in these pro-slavery areas, they would now be allowed to bring their slaves with them. And this was something that was very, very much opposed by abolitionists who, again, wanted to limit the spread of slavery into new Western territories. Okay. The anti-slavery settlers, on the other hand, refused to accept these laws, and people on each side engaged in guerrilla warfare. And this guerrilla warfare was so violent in Kansas and in Nebraska that more than 200 people were killed in what would become known as Bleeding Kansas. We've talked about John Brown before. We will continue our discussion of John Brown, who played a central figure in this violence as a an abolitionist, a radical abolitionist in Kansas. And we'll talk more about him as the unit goes on. Continuing on, violence even spilled over onto the floor of the United States Senate back in Washington. During one session, an abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, and I'll pull up a picture of him now so we can look at him. Sumner, here he is in the picture I was referring to. He was denouncing the pro-slavery legislature of Kansas on the floor of the United States Senate, and one of its supporters, Andrew Butler, an elderly Southern senator who he was speaking out against. Well, in the floor of the Senate, on the floor of the Senate, Butler's nephew, this man here, stormed onto the Senate chamber and viciously beat Charles Sumner with a cane. It took Sumner 3 years to recover. And if you can see the images here of his face, he's got cuts and bruises on his face. He suffered immensely, almost died from the attack on the floor of the United States Senate. Went into seclusion for a couple of years after that. Took him a long time to heal. Never was quite the same. But this event called the caning, okay, he was beaten with a cane. This event called the caning was an example of, or was evidence rather, of the tension that really existed between abolitionist Northerners and pro-slavery Southerners who looked at any opposition to slavery as a threat to their way of life. If you look furthermore at this image here of the caning, you've got a few senators in the background that appear to be smiling, and one that looks kind of alarmed. He was attacked right at his desk. No one really came to his aid right away, and this attack went on for moments. This, again, very, very violent episode that occurred on the floor of the United States Senate. Also during this time, people hoped that the Supreme Court could settle the issue of slavery. And in 1857, however, the court ruled on a lawsuit that divided the nation even further. This is going to be one of the most infamous meaning famous, but for not really the best of reasons, infamous. In 1857, the court ruled on a lawsuit that divided the nation further. This lawsuit involved Dred Scott, a slave whose owner had died, and he had asked the courts for his freedom. He claimed that he should be free because he had lived for a time in a free state and a free territory, the territory of Wisconsin and Minnesota. The Supreme Court decided against Dred Scott, and it basically said that Congress did not have the power to outlaw slavery in any territory. And it also said in the decision, Dred Scott v. Sandford, that slaves were considered property, not people, and they really had no right to even appear in court to bring their case against the United States. The court's ruling said that slaves were considered property, not people, and that Congress could not outlaw slavery anywhere in the United States. This decision pleased slave owners in the South, but outraged opponents of slavery in the North. Again, this is 1857, okay, Dred Scott versus Sandford. And the ruling basically said that slaves were not people, they were property and had no standing in courts. And furthermore, the Dred Scott decision said that the United States, the Congress, could not outlaw slavery anywhere in the United States. This, in effect, throughout the Missouri Compromise line of 36 degrees latitude, 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude, that in 1820 had said slavery above that line in northern territories could be barred, while slavery in the southern areas below that line, south of that line, would be allowed. Let's take a look at the Dred Scott decision diagram at the bottom, rather the chart. You will have two questions on this, on the reading in the chart, and I just want to give you guys a heads up as to what the decision said. The Dred Scott decision involved, as we said, Dred Scott, a slave who asked for his freedom because he had temporarily lived in a free state. The case was decided in 1857, and the result in 1857 on a court that was that numbered 5 slave owners. Of the 9 judges, 5 of the 9 judges on the court were slave owners. The Supreme Court ruled that a slave was property, not a citizen, and he could not file requests in court. The decision also ruled that Congress could not outlaw slavery in any of the American territories. So this decision basically is going to further drive a wedge between the Northern abolitionist movement and the Southern whites, who were arguing very vehemently in support of their right to own slaves. 2 questions on the worksheet that you guys will need to accomplish. If you could number these in a Google Doc and share them with me. The first question is, why was Kansas known as Bleeding Kansas? And the second question is based on the chart we just discussed. Why did the U.S. Supreme Court decide that Dred Scott could not file a request in court? You could answer both of those questions and submit as a Google Doc. And also, don't forget, study your vocab terms, which I've linked on the Schoology feed for this section, Chapter 16, Section 3. And also be sure to watch the supporting video clips on Dred Scott and on John Brown that I have shared as well. These are important video clips that supplement what we've learned today in our reading. I will see you guys again next class. Be safe, and Social Studies rocks. Bye.